love the analogy that our American friend gave, and I'm going to be using and co-opting this sort of example that she mentioned about the hurricane and climate change, Russia being the hurricane and climate change being China. So if the first panel was a hurricane, and I agree it was very successful, this is going to be the climate change panel today with our experts on the Indo-Pacific. So to situate a little bit of the discussion first, there's many things that we're going to talk about today in today's panel. Obviously, the rise of China, the different challenges in the Indo-Pacific. But to dovetail this with the discussion that we had in panel one, I wanted to begin with a few data points on the Ukraine crisis itself and how that's being looked at in the Indo-Pacific and where things are likely to go. So the first point is that the crisis that our Ukrainian friends are finding themselves in right now, and that our European friends are, is not just a European security crisis, but a global security crisis. And one example that I believe Angela mentioned in the original panel was the reaction to this was not just from Europe, from Canada and North America, but also from our key Asian partners. And three countries that I have in mind that have joined the international sanctions against Russia for its unprovoked war against Ukraine are Japan, South Korea, and Singapore. And if anyone wants to take the time to read a very thought-provoking speech from the Singaporean foreign minister about his defense of their sanctions against Russia, I think it's very interesting. And again, we shouldn't take this for granted. This is not something that states in Asia do easily. They generally tend to hedge when it comes especially to dealing with Russia. So that's one point to keep in mind. The second point, and I think we'll dive into this probably more in our panel discussion, is how this crisis is being viewed in China itself. Of course, we'd all love to be a fly in the wall of Xi Jinping's bedroom or the Politburo Standing Committee of 7. But my takeaway, number one, is that China, yes, is taking advantage. They're using this crisis to find vulnerabilities and take advantage of that. But at the same time, I think there's an inherent uncomfortability of how things, and I'll let Admiral Swift, I think you have a much better way of framing this, as you've mentioned this yesterday, the sort of the New England verbiage on how to frame how you think the Chinese are reacting to this crisis. But I think there's an inherent uncomfortability from the Chinese side on how things are playing out too. And one example of this was when Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was asked about the alliance between Russia and China shortly after the invasion, and then he said, there is no alliance. What alliance are you talking about? And he's not wrong. There is no effective treaty alliance, but there is an alignment and there is a convergence of interests, and that's one of the areas that we're going to be focusing on a lot today. The second key point outside of Ukraine is that while we're worried obviously about what's happening in Europe right now, it's not like challenges further afield, and especially those in the Indo-Pacific, have just stopped and said, okay, well, we're going to be on pause at this point while the Europeans figure things out on their eastern flank. Actually, conversely, some of the challenges in the Indo-Pacific have been accelerating, especially since the onset of the pandemic. And I won't make you deal with a laundry list to hear all of them, but just a few examples. Obviously, we have North Korea, which continues to proliferate its ballistic missile technology. I think it's now had its 15th or 16th missile test of the year. We have the maritime tensions in the East China Sea with Japan and China, in the South China Sea, in addition to the dangerous rhetoric that we're hearing on Taiwan. So the challenges in this part of the world have not gone away. And then this takes me to the final point, and this is a point that I think some of our excellent panelists will deal with today, is the convergence of Russia and China in this space. And again, one argument could say that potentially Russia doesn't have the capabilities or desire to interfere so much in the Pacific because it's so strapped down now in Ukraine. And while I don't think Russia is being thought of as the existential security threat to our partners in the Indo-Pacific, it is a very significant spoiler factor. And just to give a few sort of historical examples of this, and perhaps our panelists will want to talk more, one example would be in 2016 in the East China Sea on the territorial dispute between Japan and China. I remember I was in Tokyo at that point in time, and Russia and China had bilateral naval exercises at the same time that the Quad had its own naval exercises in this part of the world. And there was a curious example of a Russian ship accidentally losing its sense of navigation and sailing into the contiguous zone waters around this disputed island. Of course, the Japanese side said, well, now we have to chase the Russian ship out. And as soon as they did that, the Chinese side said, wait a sec, the Japanese are in our waters now, so we've got to chase the Japanese out. And this effectively was the first time the Chinese Navy had entered the contiguous zone around those islands. So those sort of examples, and we've seen more recent examples around the territorial dispute between South Korea and Japan as well. So these type of examples of whether you call it collusion, whether you call it confusion, have been happening at pace between Russia and China militarily. With that being said, I'm going to kick things off because I'm not the star of the show today, but these are the stars here. And I'm going to start with Jim Pritsup. So we're kind of mixing the order up here a little bit. You know, in the vein of what Brian said at the beginning, I'm also not a fan of long introductions. So Jim, you'll accept my apologies for not reading your long and distinguished bio. But take my word for it, Jim is a seasoned expert on all things Indo-Pacific, has spent a career focused on especially Japan issues, and is now a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. So Jim, if I can turn to you first to sort of set the stage a little bit with some context on this, and then I'll move to the other panelists.
Jonathan, thanks for the short introduction. Sincerely appreciated. And sincere thanks and appreciation to MLI for the invitation to participate in this conference. To me, it's almost like being home, coming home. I grew up on the east side of Detroit, less than 10 miles from the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel, played hockey in the Windsor Arena, and spent many pleasant weekends in Bell River, Ontario, on Saturday nights at the Bell River House with Bell River Betty on the piano, and pictures of Molson's on the tables. Those are great evenings I'll always remember. And fond memories of Ottawa also. As a member of the State Department's policy planning staff, I was here when the senators came into being long ago. And on another occasion, up from Washington for consultations, we ran into a full-scale Canadian blizzard. You know, in Washington, snow is a panic-inducing four-letter word. But Ottawa actually worked through the blizzard. And that was quite remarkable to see that. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. And it's also great to be here today on this beautiful spring day. It's just wonderful. So thanks again for the invitation to be here. And now on to the free and open Indo-Pacific, which kind of frames, I think, the discussion of where we're at and where we're going in terms of the region. It's a vision of regional order that is now widely accepted and widely adopted as well. But first, a brief step back into history. How did we get here? In 2005, China advanced the concept of an Asia-Pacific community based on ASEAN +3, China, Japan, and the ROK. Not invited, of course, were the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and India. Concerned with China's potential to dominate this ASEAN +3 framework, Japan moved to define a broader rules-based Indo-Pacific order. Foreign Minister Taro Aso, in his 2000 remarks, The Arc of Freedom and Prosperity, set out concepts of governance to guide the emerging regional order. Universal values: democracy, freedom, human rights, the rule of law, and the market economy. The arc ran from Northeast Asia through Central Asia to the Middle East. Subsequently, Prime Minister Abe, in his Confluence of the Two Seas remarks, extended the arc to the United States, Australia, and Africa, a region defined by fundamental values, freedom, democracy, respect for human rights, governed by the rule of law, free from force or coercion as the principles to guide this emerging order. The free and open Indo-Pacific became Japanese government policy, and similar versions emphasizing the rule of law, freedom of navigation, the opposition to the use of force or coercion to change the status quo, have now been adopted by the United States, Australia, India, ASEAN, by France, the UK, the Netherlands, and the EU as well. This regional order is now under stress. Over the past 3 decades, China's dynamic economy, joined by double-digit increases in defense spending, have given Beijing new instruments of power and influence, which Beijing has not hesitated to use, either as reward or punishment. Now, there's a long, long history here, but just to cite a few: Beijing's response to the 2010 Senkaku fishing boat incident, its response to the 2017 decision by the ROK to deploy the THAAD missile defense system, its construction and militarization of artificial structures in the South China Sea, its disregard for the Hague ruling in the South China Sea arbitration case, and the use of the PLA Navy and Coast Guard to advance territorial claims in the South China Sea, and the use of the PLA Army on the China-Indian frontier. And on February 4th of this year, China joined Russia in opposing the United States' Indo-Pacific strategy. As for the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, the argument that I would make here is that its emphasis on Indo-Pacific alliances, on multilateralism, and cooperation with European allies reflects a continuing evolution of strategic policy across the region and now beyond into Europe in response to an increasingly assertive and authoritarian China, representing a concerted pushback over the past decade or so. So here's what's been going on and what continues today. Let's start with Japan. In response to an increasingly severe security environment, Japan, under the Abe, Suga, and now Kishida governments, has moved to strengthen Japan's own defense capabilities, with now over a decade of increases in defense spending. A 2% increase is now before the government. At the same time, strengthening the Japan-US alliance. Abe revised Japan's constitution to provide for the limited exercise of collective self-defense, adopted the 2015 defense guidelines, expanding areas of Japan-US defense cooperation, and opening the door to Japan's defense cooperation with third countries. In particular, we've seen with Australia and the Philippines. In 2019, the Japan-US Security Consultative Meeting agreed to align Japan-US strategic policy documents and cautioned that, and quote, the geopolitical competition and coercive attempts to undermine international rules, norms, and institutions presents challenges to the alliance and the shared vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. This strategic alignment was reaffirmed in January of this year. Both the US and Japan have recently emphasized the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and there are now reports of US-Japan planning for a Taiwan contingency. Japan has also stepped up defense engagement with the region. In 2018, signing with ASEAN the Vientiane Vision for comprehensive defense cooperation, and this year signing with Australia and the UK the reciprocal access agreements to provide for closer defense cooperation, and reaching agreement with Indonesia and Vietnam on the transfer of defense equipment and technology. Japan's self-defense force has regularly participated in the region-wide military exercises, the Malabar exercise with India, the United States, Australia, the La Perouse exercise with France, India, and Australia navies, and the Talisman Sabre exercise with Australia and the United States. And building on the growing interest in the Indo-Pacific, Japan has initiated 2+2 dialogues with Canada in 2011, with Australia in 2012, with France in 2014, the UK in 2015, India in 2019, and with Germany in last year. Now looking south, Australia and the United States have made the Indo-Pacific the focal point of the alliance, with particular emphasis on the maritime domain, and established a joint force posture working group to promote a secure and stable region and deter coercive acts and use of force. Of note, Australia's Defense Strategic Update 2020 called for the development of long-range capabilities that can hold at-risk adversary forces and infrastructure far from Australia. And recently, Bloomberg is reporting that from the U.S. Embassy in Canberra that U.S.-Australia are engaged again in joint planning talks on a Taiwan contingency. And now AUKUS. In addition to nuclear-powered submarines, I think the key elements here is the agreement provides for cooperation in the development of defense technologies. And this year expanded to include cooperation in the development of hypersonics and electronic warfare capabilities. Now, I'm not sure that AUKUS qualifies as multilateralism, but I would put the Quad in this context. Again, the Quad has a long history, originating as a functional response to the 2004 tsunami in Southeast Asia, and as a strategic concept in Shinzo Abe's Democratic Security Diamond. Now, the Security Diamond fell victim to political atrophy in Canberra, in Washington, New Delhi, and in particular to China's very strong opposition, only to be revised as concerns about China heightened, and last year institutionalized as a leaders' summit meeting. At the Quad Summit, the leaders committed to strengthen democracy, the role of international law in the maritime domain, collaboration to sustain a rules-based order in the East and South China Sea. The Quad leaders met again on March 3rd to discuss Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The leaders also used the occasion to reaffirm their commitment to the free and open Indo-Pacific, to respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, free from military, economic, or political coercion. Prime Minister Kishida added, "We've agreed that unilateral changes in the status quo like this should not be allowed in the Indo-Pacific. We've also agreed this development makes it even more important to work toward realizing a free and open Indo-Pacific." The Quad Summit follows next week in Tokyo. At the same time, Quad members, Australia, India, and Japan, have moved to strengthen bilateral relationships through summits and 2+2 dialogues. To my mind, collectively speaking to the emergence of a strategic triangle among Asia's democracies, supporting a free and open Indo-Pacific. As noted above, as I mentioned above, France, the UK, Netherlands, Germany, and the EU have all released Indo-Pacific policy documents, all recognizing their growing interest in the region and the need for greater engagement. France's Indo-Pacific defense strategy has encouraged European partners to get more involved in the region, where tougher strategic competition could have a direct impact on European security. The Dutch document linked stability in the South China Sea to European prosperity and security. And in the UK, the Johnson government has announced its Indo-Pacific tilt, recognizing that China poses an increasing risk to the UK interests. The UK is now investing in China-facing capabilities to meet the challenges it poses to the UK's security, prosperity, and values. Now, clearly, Russia and the Ukraine, I think, will keep European allies focused on the continent for the foreseeable future, and that could be a very foreseeable future. But there's also a clear recognition in the European long-term strategic planning documents that the world's geostrategic center is shifting to Asia, and that Europe has significant interests there. While a European security presence in the Indo-Pacific is not likely to be significant, I think the normative value of Europe's engagement cannot be underestimated. Although various visions of the free and open Indo-Pacific are not identical in either geographic extent or individual countries' interests, they are, I think, congruent in fundamental values and interests. Today, the Indo-Pacific is no longer defined by the historic bilateral hub and spokes alliance structure emanating from Washington. While the alliance structure remains foundational, it is now being reinforced by a complex set of interlocking and overlapping bilateral and multilateral relationships within the region and now extending to Europe, yielding a complex mosaic lattice-like structure, reflecting not only shared values, democracy and the rule of law, but also hard security interests, freedom of navigation, and the opposition to the use of force or coercion to change the status quo. Coming now back to Russia and the Indo-Pacific and China, against a background of concerns about the future of the international order, the unified response of democracies in Europe and in Asia to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to my mind, has been striking in the rapid evolution of the sanctions regime and in support for the international order. Recently, the UK's Foreign Secretary Liz Truss underscored the linkage between Europe and Asia, telling the Atlantic Council that conflict anywhere threatens security everywhere. The Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific are indivisible. She concluded, together, the UK, the US, the G7, Canada, and Japan will face down aggression around the world, from the South China Sea to Eastern Europe. This will be the test of Western democracies, I believe, and I'll close here. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Jim. I mean, that really thorough and great scan of the different Indo-Pacific strategies, and I think you referenced whether it's from France and Germany and our Dutch friends, and I don't have wood to knock on, but let me say that I hope and I trust that the Canadians will be there to join you when our Indo-Pacific strategy comes out very soon. So that was very well noted. And one thing that I think that's interesting when you talked about the free and open Indo-Pacific, and it's important to say what it is, but I think it's also important to say what it is not. And I think there's a sense that when talking about the Quad, when talking about AUKUS, that this is, in a sense, and maybe this is a narrative that, that those in Beijing like to promote, is that these are disruptive changes. But fundamentally, when I see the free and open Indo-Pacific, as you said, it's about the status quo. It's not about change. It's about maintaining the status quo. And maintaining a certain level of rules, norms that are girded in international law, in the peaceful settlement of disputes. So it's not about change. The second point that I think is important is the intellectual origins of thinking about this region of the Indo-Pacific. Well, first of all, came from a German admiral of all people in the late 19th century in geographic terms, but in geopolitical terms, did not come from the United States, but actually came from the region itself. Whether it was Abe Shinzo or friends in India and Australia that first started thinking about this concept about the confluence of two oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, the supply chain elements and the security considerations that go along with that. So I think that's another fundamentally important point. The Americans now are using the free and open Indo-Pacific, but this terminology did not start and originate.
It's not made in the USA.
Not made in the USA. Although I think former Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo was whispering this into the ears of many American advisors, and now is made in the USA. So, okay, with that noted, Admiral Swift, can I turn to you now? And again, Admiral Swift, I'm going to be very quick on your introduction, your bio, but a distinguished background, former commander of the Pacific Fleet.
That's sufficient.
Yeah, that's sufficient. He's cut me off already. But take my word, a very significant experience in this part of the world. And Admiral, we benefit from your wisdom.
Thanks, Jonathan. And Brian, congratulations to you and what MLI has done. I first met Jonathan at a virtual conference that was hosted by APCSS in Hawaii. And we talked in the margins of that discussion about perhaps someday coming to Ottawa, and now that day has arrived. MLI is just fantastic in what they have done from the support staff, absolutely transparent. This is the first travel I've done out of the country in over 2 years. Somewhat new. My passport had expired since I hadn't been using it. Came to understand that about a week and a half ago, and your staff was fantastic in being patient with me as I worked through those problems. So congratulations to you and MLI and what it does here. So we spent yesterday, organized by Jonathan, spending some time with Defense and the Foreign Ministry. And it reinforced some thinking that was somewhat nascent in my mind, along with some other conversations I've had with ongoing conversations with Chinese colleagues. So I just have a list of comments I'm going to really make in the interest in generating a dialogue and discussion. If you're not interested in those things, that's fine. You can take them off the table and not address them in your questions. One thing Jonathan said that I think is very important is that we spend a lot of time thinking about what the right thing to do is, when oftentimes the wrong things to do are being presented to us in a very clear context, and yet we don't address them. So we should fence those things off and take them off the table. So if these comments are not interesting to you, feel free to let them go. I've spent an awful lot of time talking about the international rules-based order. I don't intend on doing that today. I had a sense of urgency that people were focused in the wrong space, intellectual space, with respect to the competition, certainly that the United States and the PRC are in. And the competition, it's much more than just an economic competition. Too oftentimes in the United States, we think of it as a military competition. That's very dangerous. It is not a military competition. If we focus in that context, then we could turn it into one. But I really think it's a contest over the international rules-based order. I think it is. I would disagree a little bit, Jonathan. I do think it's about change. But what is it that we want to change, and why do we want to change it, and what are the mechanisms that we're going to change? I think that's really the crux of the issue. There's over 25 international courts and tribunals that have been established in order to moderate and judge on where changes need to be made, where the countries that have frictions that are occurring on the global stage can't resolve those frictions on their own. These are the courts that have been established to turn to help resolve those differences. The underlying drive being discourse and dialogue, diplomacy, rather than force and coercion. And I think it's this growing force and coercion that we're seeing really around the globe, especially from authoritarian governments, that is the most troubling, and I think that's what Prime Minister Abe was talking about. We do need a whole-of-government approach, which I commend conferences like this that focus on that. I'm very pleased that there is a military background individual that's a part of this panel. I'm even more pleased that there was no military on the last panel. I am not an expert on anything, but I've got a lot of experience. I cut Jonathan off before he could say that I had 40 years of experience in the Navy. I used to say I was more surprised than anybody about how long I stayed in the Navy, and then there'd be a long line of people after that comment, and I think, wow, I really must have hit it out of the park on this one. Everybody wants to congratulate me on this comment, and everybody wants to say, no, I was more surprised than you that you lasted as long as you did. So my ego couldn't take it anymore. Had a really interesting discussion with Brian earlier about the collaboration that needs to occur between liberal democracies. I think that's one of the driving takeaways from what's happening in Ukraine right now. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian ambassador, I think, had to leave, but I think that's really what his comments that he made earlier spoke to me. And so this isn't about a counter narrative. I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. It's about a collaborative narrative. We need to talk about the things that we believe in together. So there's a collaborative narrative between the United States and Canada, but it doesn't incorporate all the Canadian national security interests, nor does it incorporate all the US national security interests. The beauty of liberal democracies is that we can agree to disagree. And that's what our greatest strength is. It's the diversities that are occurring within that international rules-based order that has been driven by liberal democracies. I try not to say China. It's not about China. Too oftentimes, at least my peers in the United States would say we need to be careful about adopting the PRC vernacular, and I think we need to be thoughtful about adopting it. But in the PRC vernacular, when you say China, you're talking about the Chinese people. I would be very cautious about saying that the Chinese people are the problem that we face with respect to the frictions that we have with the PRC. That's not my personal view, and it's not my professional view. That's not been my experience in the Indo-Asia Pacific. The PRC is an extension of the Chinese Communist Party. It's the mechanism by which their policies are deployed and employed, both domestically and internationally. That is an area to focus on. But the core focus is on the Chinese Communist Party, because that's where this divergence occurs and this thought about the international rules-based system. The fourth is Xi Jinping, and I think there's a sense about how powerful Xi Jinping is. He's very powerful, but he's very beholden to the Chinese Communist Party. I think that's very different in the equation that we see with respect to Putin and the Russian government. I'm not a Russian expert, but we have one here on the panel that might be interested in commenting on that. I think a deterrence has a lot of factors that leads to its strength, but one of the most critical factors is relevance. I believe it's the coin that you drop into the deterrence machine to create deterrence. There's two sides of that relevance coin. One side is focused on the relevance to those that you're trying to deter. The other side is focused on those that you're trying to reassure, allies, partners, and friends. It's not a binary choice. You have to understand when you drop that coin into the deterrence machine that both sides are playing. And I think from the United States in particular, we haven't been thoughtful enough about that in the past. Well, now that we see this rise of China to a peer competitor with the United States, I think we need to be much more thoughtful about what is deterrence. Is it really deterring those that we would try to deter? And what are the implications of the impact to those that we're trying to reassure as allies, partners, and friends? There needs to be much more dialogue rather than less dialogue. Michael, really interested in the entire panel before, but Michael made a comment about Putin, and I'll probably misquote you. Feel free not to correct me in public. About Putin, what I heard, what it translated in my mind is you were talking about what Putin is taking advantage of. He's taking the next opportunity. What he's taking advantage of is a core strength in liberal democracies. It is messy, and we are going to make mistakes. In the United States, the debate that's going on under this leaked document that came out of the Supreme Court, it's the power of who we are as Americans. It's the power of what we believe as liberal democracies. It's something to behold. That conversation cannot exist in authoritarian government. And that's what Putin, that's what Xi Jinping, that's what the Chinese Communist Party are taking advantage of. But we need to recognize that we need to come to collectively, not to take a side on the arguments, but take a side on the process. And we can no longer be silent. You know, we had indications in Georgia, we had indications elsewhere of what Putin might do, and Putin used that as his primary intelligence source that the international community would not react if he attacked into Ukraine. Ukraine is very different than Taiwan. I'm sorry, I'm running on here, Jonathan. I'll try to wrap up. So I write these little cards. So everybody thinks this won't take long, but I've got 150 of them stacked right here. So I had a very interesting discussion, as I mentioned, with some Chinese counterparts, and I use Chinese in the context that I explained earlier. And this is, I would summarize it in this statement from them. What is Ukraine to the Pacific? Ukraine is not Taiwan. This was one of the views from out of this discussion. Ukraine was not Taiwan, and Russia is not the PRC. PRC is Ukraine, and the US is Russia. So if you think, how is it that they are trying to change the dialogue? The first thought is, how do I more deeply understand that concept? Because these are individuals that I have regular dialogues with. This wasn't just pulled out of the air. This is a belief that's coming out of that culture. So we need to better understand these statements that at least to me, I view it with discontinence. I have a hard time understanding how to connect it with my own belief system. And that's where I think we need to spend more time thinking. The previous panel talked about liberal democracies and autocracies. I think that's exactly where the nexus of this discussion is. I think we should be very careful about discussions that talk about decoupling. Decoupling is occurring now in Shanghai because of COVID, and everyone that is engaged in the international economic system is being negatively impacted by it in ways that we won't fully understand. I go back, maybe it was Michael that mentioned about the economic sanctions. We won't fully understand, I don't think, certainly not within 6 months and maybe not within 12 months, what those implications are. So I am very interested in comments made about decoupling. I do not like the term containment. No one is advantaged by trying to contain China. We should be encouraging China to expand, but under the international rules-based order. And where they feel that international rules-based order contains them, let's have a dialogue, a discourse, let's engage with diplomacy. And if we can't resolve those differences, let's turn to the right international court to resolve those differences. There was a discussion about winning. I go back to in the previous panel, I go back to my military experience. Winning is a metric, a balance, an assessment that is done in both an objective matter first and then a subjective matter, in a subjective manner of successes and failures. It's done in run from a military perspective. It's not a fait accompli. Unless you're talking about a war without constraints. If you're talking about a declared war, then diplomacy is off the table, and you're talking about unconditional surrender. That is a path that is fraught with peril. It will look very different than World War II, just because of nuclear weapons and what we've seen in Ukraine. So I think it's I can remember the evening, the first night of OIF, going back to my stateroom. I was a deputy air wing commander, and the fleet commander had come out and had talked about what was going to unfold in the next few days as Operation Iraqi Freedom kicked off. And I remember I was a captain at the time, and I went back to my stateroom and maybe channeling Colin Powell when I thought, I'm not sure what the strategic objective is here, what the national objective is. So we need to think through these mechanisms, especially from a military concept, before we reach into that national security toolbox and pull out the hammer of the military. Military should always be in support of diplomacy. As soon as it isn't, the military just destroys things. It destroys things until it drives things to a state of equilibrium that diplomacy can once again be applied. And then the last point I will make is this, is that I don't like the term red lines, because red lines are what the military loves because we like binary problems. I much prefer red zones. Red zones gives diplomatic space for people to discuss what the problems were. I use a mistake made in Syria when President Obama made the comment that the use of chemical weapons was a red line. It drew a specific target for Russia and Syria to move right up to and then to cross to challenge the United States. I think a much better approach would have been to say, if you use chemical weapons, you're in a red zone of national security interests of the United States. We will assess what happened at the time and place and make a decision about what we will do based on our national security interest at a time, place, and method of our choosing. That's what deterrence looks like. So I said I was going to close on that point, but there's two other things that come to my mind. I'm a big believer in strategic ambiguity, especially when it comes to Taiwan. That gives you space to negotiate and maneuver diplomatically. There's a push. Many of my peers think that we should reduce that ambiguity, that it's a national security threat. I think it's a national security enabler. And the last thing I'll say is a new word. I'm trying to figure out how to navigate around the elevators in this system. And in the hotel here, the first thing is I realized they're not elevators, they're lifts. So I was riding in the lift earlier, and I rode with a young lady that was in one of the discussions yesterday. And she was commenting on her surprise of a comment that I made. I worry more about the fall of China than the rise of China. The rise of China can be managed in the context of the international rules-based order as long as liberal democracies that understand the power of it continue to advocate for it. And we're not doing that collectively. I don't know how you put China back together if it falls. Russia, I think, is less problematic because it's less economically invested globally. But we're seeing this with COVID just in Shanghai. If the Chinese system fails, I don't know what replaces it. And but I don't think the impact is calculable. So hopefully that's given you some thoughts about questions that you may want to ask the true experts on the panel. But I look forward to those comments. Thank you, Jonathan.
Admiral Swift, thank you very much. And as an NFL fan, I like red zones too, and red lines have shown that they've the terminology of them and the adherence to them, it's been ambiguous. So I like the terminology of red zones. I just wonder how big those red zones get. And whether there's red zone creep, whether they get a little bit big is one thing. Your point on economic statecraft is vitally important. And again, I don't want to continue to hammer on the line of the TPP and urge our American friends to rejoin the club and make it a 12. But whether it's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework or whether it's other tools of economic engagement, and this is not just on the shoulders of the US, but I think this is more broadly the West, the Quad Plus group, that economic leg of engagement is absolutely essential. This is not just on the hands of the Navy. This has to be a full, robust, comprehensive, collaborative effort that involves diplomacy, development, economics, military, and even civil society. So even think tanks, scholars, et cetera, private sector.
Can I drop a coin in the
Please.
time machine? Just so red zones are an issue of national policy to scope and scale them, and I think they should be changed. But just as with strategy, I think we should be careful about changing strategy. So I know you're working on an Indo-Asia strategy here from a Canadian perspective, but it should provide sufficient consistency to allow the change in government it should accommodate those changes. A whole nother discussion. But I think the red zone is a national security policy issue. I get your point on the extension and the contraction of it. And I think the military in times of competition and even crisis should be in full support of the foreign ministry, or in our case, the State Department, not acting on its own. But there's a lot to unpack there. I'll stop. Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you. And just one last comment before going to Una, and I think this is a really nice segue to your presentation, Una, is going back to the perceptions that China may have coming out of the Ukraine crisis. And one of the perceptions and the narratives that I often hear, if you read Chinese state press on this, follows along the Russian narrative that this conflict was precipitated in Ukraine by the expansion of NATO, and this was not the fault of the Russian side, but this was the fault of the West, the continually expanding NATO. You're seeing the mirror image or the reverse narrative in China now as it relates to the Quad, as it relates to alliances. And I think the reality that I see on the ground is not so much that these groupings have been created and are growing to contain China, but are in a response to the challenges that China has been presenting. At some point, if you have a problem with every one of your neighbors, it's no longer their problem, but it's your problem. So I think that the idea that the region has bounded up to gang against China versus the idea that China has a lot of unresolved disputes with almost all of its neighbors is a challenge that needs to be addressed. On that difficult point, Una, I'm going to turn to you, and we're delighted to have you. Dr. Una Alexandra Berzina-Serenkova. You have a really long title, but you are head of Riga Stradiņš University China Studies Center and many other distinguished titles. You've just published a book, which is super exciting. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that as well. Welcome to Ottawa, and grateful for your thoughts.
Thank you, and it's an honor to be here, and thank you, Emily, and for having me here. Well, first of all, I want to say that indeed China's narratives, including China's backing and the extent of China's backing of Russia and Ukraine, is my bread and butter, is what I do for a living. So, but I think that today, and so if Jonathan will steer me in that direction, then you will have. You will have to suffer the consequences of me talking about it for a long, long time. But first, I want to say that Jonathan has been generous enough and has allowed me not to dwell on the Indo-Pacific as such, but rather to touch upon the consequences of the Russia-China relationship and the Chinese outlook on the Indo-Pacific as well, which is a result of that, on Europe and more specifically on the Baltic states. So that's where I will be placing my remarks then. And if you want me to zoom in or zoom out, make sure you tell me or wink. And I think here, when it comes to the Sino-Baltic relations, change is indeed the operative word. And let me give you some context here. Interestingly enough, I mean, some of the things that I will be talking about, you will hear that they apply to a wider EU context, and I think Lauren knows that very well. However, others are specific for our region, not specifically the Baltic, but for example, also the Visegrad countries, because they're shaped by the lack of experiences in our exchanges with China. They're also shaped by China's lack of experience in exchanges with us. They are shaped by geography. They're shaped by size. Yesterday at the ministry, we discussed how China has changed its narrative on the fact that the size of the countries matter, in fact. And also, of course, they're shaped by China's own projections on us. As we know, the three Baltic states were originally entered the 16+1 format, and then also were, starting from 2016, signatories of signed MOUs pledging love and allegiance to Belt and Road. So that's a very important point. So it's not just about how we view China, it's about these projections that China places on our regions. So let me give you a context a little bit. Actually, there are several developments shaping our relations with China, and starting in the early 2000s when there was not much China in the region. In fact, we were presenting ourselves as to China as these countries that had the know-how on how to cooperate with Russia in Europe. And that's, I think, change number one. So, and that is where a 160 has occurred, right? So that was the narrative, you know, we have this experience of, we know, we're European, and yet we know how Russia operates, so this is where our role is. And that is like a pre-16+1, pre-Belt and Road logic. The next step, of course, is, you know, 2012 up to 2017, 2018, looking to China to already substitute Russia. So not anymore our knowledge when it comes to Russia, but maybe it could be a substitute, and a little bit also to counter Russia. We all, there was this anecdote about, you know, hope that Russia had been impeding our ports from developing, and maybe, you know, it sounds familiar in different contexts. Maybe Beijing can apply some pressure and do something. If we cooperate with them, then they can tell Moscow to be on our, to kind of be productive here. So again, changed. That has changed tremendously. As a side note here, I want to say, however, that the Baltics, and as you well know, because the first session interestingly touched upon the Baltics as well, which is always surprising for me when I'm in North America, but as a side note, of course, we were never playing the pillar game. There was never any political allegiance or promise thereof to Beijing. It was always, oh, let's see if we can cooperate. See, the others are cooperating. You know, half of Europe is trading with you guys, so why don't we try? So it was never about, in terms of pillars, the Baltic states have always been very clear. So when we hear these allegations saying, well, you try to flirt with Beijing, I'm always very strongly against, I'm always very opposed to these, because that was never a promise the Baltics made. It was always very clear. Brussels is our home, the US is our security guarantor, and, you know, if you want to try out something economical, then go ahead. Now, and then after 2018, a whole new period, and again, change. Realizing that, you know, the challenges from China, actually, they do not counter the challenges from Russia, but they rather overlap with them. There was intransparency, you know, the pressure to grant contracts, the pressure to, you know, take our loans and then give 50%, over 50% of the component of the tender to our companies. That never, you know, there were no Belt and Road projects in the region, so that never came to be. But nevertheless, during the conversations at the table, that was quite evident. And then we also saw China's approach where it kind of followed Russian channels, especially in the media. So we could establish how, when it came to the public, to the information space, China was kind of trying to walk down the path that Russia had already laid. Although I have to make a point that when it came to business, China actually was trying to establish links with mainstream EU-minded companies rather than the ones that were closely related with the Russian establishment. So that could have something to do in business logic, with business logic. But then after 2018, not least due to Washington's signals, the realization that the window of cooperation with China is closing. We had the Huawei case, we had the Hikvision case, of course, the famous case of the Klaipėda port, which was a security versus Chinese investment decision, which was fast to be an anti-China decision, obviously. And I can't help but wonder now, are we at the brink of the next change, of the next step, where we just look at China as Russia's facilitator in the region? And let me tell you what I mean by that. Well, first of all, in the Lithuanian argument with China, in China's argument with Lithuania, we saw mutually amplifying behavior between China and Russia. And I think the Lithuanians in the room can attest to that as well, or comment on that. So, or Lithuanians by extension, like Michael. There was a feeling that China, I'm a discourse analyst, so I look at stories a lot. And the story that China was amplifying in domestic information was that Lithuania, that's something you would expect. Lithuania has been trying to bully Russia for many years, and also turned and has been attacking Russia, and so this only makes sense. That kind of amplification. A second, of course, example is Ukraine. My Polish colleagues, such as Justyna Sudlik, are saying that there's a very certain China's rhetoric support to Russia. I don't go as far, although I respect her analysis a lot. Of course, I still I believe that there are some arguments that China amplifies, such as the NATO story, right? You shouldn't have pushed on Russia. You shouldn't have pushed a big country to the wall. That's what happens. But when it comes to other narratives, such as the denazification story, on that side, the Chinese foreign policy establishment is silent. It's kind of self-serving. You pick and choose from the Russian narrative. But so I make that argument in general. But when it comes I make a wider argument against overestimating the love and trust that China and Russia share. But when you zoom in my region, then it shows that China can sacrifice its strategic partners, even Ukraine, right? Even though it's not happy with Russia's actions, but it's ready to make that move. So even though this support is self-served and limited, and I do not believe, by the way, in the alliance story, not just because Wang Yi has said no to it, and also because, and not because Lavrov before the war had been playing with it. Well, we're almost allies, right? But one of the chapters in the book actually is trying to deconstruct the story about the alliance, and I don't buy it. I mean, I could be wrong, but nevertheless, it is an issue in our region that there is. There are interests that align between Russia and China. So I can't help but wonder if this next step is going to be China as the Russian facilitator in my region. And I want to say that these periods are almost like an illustration of a wider European 180, but squeezed into, so almost played fast forward and squeezed into the period of just 1 decade. And all nuance aside, the result is the same. We're just where most of our European partners are, even those who have much deeper links with China. We see that security trumps cooperation, security trumps business logic. Now, I have not forgotten where I'm at. I have not forgotten. It's hard to forget that you're in Ottawa when you're looking at such a splendid view. So let me talk about the Canadian role and North American role in this. Well, first of all, awareness. You've helped us be aware and become aware of these things, and we listen. We listen on China, and I think that's one thing that's come out of it, and that's, you can disagree something that the previous speaker said, but that's the beauty of it. At the end of the day, you listen. Second, presence, of course, and this is not a China-related issue, of course, I understand, but still, we know, Canada is a support to our security, and we appreciate that. So presence, acknowledgement that we are delivering and that we're bearing the costs. With China, of course, it's more subtle and the costs are more limited, more niche, but specifically Lithuania is bearing a huge amount of costs. With Russia as well. Marcus spoke of, civil society media support. We've been doing that, right? Refugees now. Something that we've been actually communicating to the Chinese very actively, to the Chinese delegation, that we're on a salvage mission to Central and Eastern Europe to see what can be done about 16+1 just a few weeks ago. That's the story that we tell. Look at the refugees. That we are talking about Russia's invasion in Ukraine as a problem. We're communicating that to the Chinese side, making them feel very uncomfortable on the other side of the table. So the refugees, what we didn't expect, right? We didn't expect the short-term refugee profile, something we weren't ready for, and we're bearing those costs. People who are saying, I don't have time to study Latvian right now because I'm not staying. I need a job today, and my kids need a place to sleep today. Something we've never come across before. And of course, the domestic societal resilience is also suffering. It's another cost that we're bearing. There's a renegotiation now, regardless whether you support it or not. There's the conversation about taking down a monument or two. It is destabilizing. And this is the story that we're willing to bear these costs and also to tell it to the Chinese side, for better or worse. Now, so these things that I think need to be, please keep doing them if you're not doing them yet. On the NATO level now, actually, I was one of the people a year ago already, time flies, that was actively publishing and advocating for a double searchlight approach in the run-up to the NATO strategic concept. Talking, of course, yes, we're going to have Indo-Pacific appear in the strategic concept. That's unavoidable. But don't forget that NATO is strong and mighty enough to have two searchlights and to keep that searchlight, the original searchlight, the searchlight on my region on. And as you all know, last year, when the weather was just about the same, that was a very interesting point to make. People thought there was no point in that original searchlight anymore. But I think that point has been made for me, again, sadly. And another thing I want to say about the NATO level is keep that searchlight in Europe shining bright. Yes, the concept is going to focus, of course. I think it's no secret. It's going to focus. It's going to have an Indo-Pacific focus, but keep that European searchlight shining bright. And if indeed, as the previous panel suggested, this conflict drags out, make sure to change the light bulb from time to time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Una. That was really helpful on many different levels, and especially your sort of phrasing and talking about the friendship without limits. I think it's called the Russia-China relationship, and I would put a caveat there that I think that friendship is a friendship without limits until there's a line that's crossed. And if the Chinese all of a sudden decide to strike a security deal with Kazakhstan or with Turkmenistan for the PLA to be placed there, I think all of a sudden that friendship without limits starts to reach its period of expiration. Another interesting point, and this kind of goes back to the first panel. I think Michael made this point about the nature of what a state has to offer, and I think you made very astute point that there's not much that Russia has to offer at this point in time. China has a lot to offer, and I think this is the big difference when we're talking about meeting the challenge of China, and I think it's in particular on the economic side. And this is, yes, we all know about the negative externalities about the Belt and Road Initiative, but the reality is the region also needs infrastructure. So rather than just saying the Belt and Road Initiative is predatory lending and this is not something you should do, we have to provide real alternatives. And when I say a we, it's not just one country, it's not just on the shoulders of the United States or the Quad, but it's going to take a village, so to say. And maybe this is a good segue, Jim, to turn to you. And one point that has sort of been on my mind, and this is something that came up in the first panel as well, and again, maybe you can talk to it from a US context, but I think this is something the Canadian side is thinking about, and I think all those in the NATO alliance are thinking about, is this balancing of the challenges of a revisionist Russia, obviously having a focus where it should be right now in the transatlantic, but knowing that it's not just a long-term lens in the Indo-Pacific, it's right now. It's short-term, medium-term, long-term, and this is no tactical set up a task force and deal with the challenges of the Indo-Pacific. We're in for the long haul. So if you could speak to that in a little bit, in addition to your other comments about how this balance is happening right now in Washington, and how you see this playing out. Just as a quick introduction, Jim is a great expert, senior vice president at the Council on Foreign Relations. And on that note, your most recent book, titled "The Empty Throne: America's Abdication of Global Leadership," maybe that can be an extra element to add to that question that I provided you. Jim, please, the floor is yours.
Well, Jonathan, first, thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks to the MLI for being here, for having such a lovely venue, with providing me with such a lovely vista. Clearly, Ottawa is a lovely city. I think based on the conversation so far and the insights that Jim and Scott and Una have offered, you can get a sense of why I feel privileged to be up here on the stage today. I'm going to try to take up Jonathan's challenge. I think what I'd like to do is really sort of expand our conversation, or the framing of our conversation, try to tie a little bit into this morning's discussions and highlight, I think, some themes running through the remarks so far, and really sort of maybe try to tie some things together. And I guess where I would begin, or our conversation began here today, or at least this session, was about regional or global security challenges. And I think really, and I think this came up most evidently in Scott's comments, our challenge is actually quite bigger. It is really about whether or not we can sustain the global order that was created in the wake of World War II. Let's call it the rules-based order. That seems to be the chosen phrase. It is an order that has brought unprecedented prosperity and security to countries around the world. It is also an order that is under great stress. And I guess if I could make 3 points, the first one would be, I think historians are going to look back at February 24th as an end of an era, as sort of bringing to a close what we can call, for now, the post-Cold War era. And if you think back to it, let's go back 3 decades. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the rules-based order seemed to be both unchallenged and unchallengeable. History apparently had ended, and old adversaries like Russia and potential new rivals like China seemed to have no choice but to embrace the rule of law and the free flow of people, capital, goods, and ideas, or they risk being left behind. There's a lot of optimism back in the 1990s, and none of that has turned out to be the case. And I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has been defended and justified by China, as Una just mentioned, has confirmed what has been apparent for several years. And Jim, I think, outlined some examples in his remarks, and that is that the rules-based order is at risk of collapse. And I think it is recognition of that basic fact that explains why the West, which is a political construct, not a geographical one, reacted with the unity it has, unity that hasn't been seen since either the height or the depths of the Cold War, depending upon the metaphor you wish to pick. And I think that unity came as a surprise to Vladimir Putin. I assume it came as a surprise to the Chinese Politburo, and perhaps it even came as a surprise to the West itself. Indeed, I recall being part of discussions in early February about how savvy Putin was. He was going to not only take a bite out of Ukraine, he was going to maneuver it in such a way that he was going to split the transatlantic alliance. There was no way the Germans would close ranks with the Americans. We were talking about the end of the transatlantic alliance. That is not what happened. Russia today is the world's most sanctioned country. The United States and the European Union are moving to reduce dependence upon Russian oil and gas. More than 40 countries have provided a variety of military aid to Ukraine. And again, we tend to focus in our conversations on what Washington is doing or what it is that Germany is doing or Britain is doing. But it's important to note that countries in Asia are doing things, and many of them are doing things they're not used to doing. We talked about some of that this morning. Singapore, Jim mentioned Japan, South Korea as well. And that really leads to my second point, which is that what the events of the last 2+ months have shown to the countries of the West is that they are stronger together. For several decades, we have been mesmerized by talk about the rise of China, the revitalization or supposed revitalization of Russia under the leadership of Vladimir Putin. I'll just remind everybody that the countries of the West account for more than 60% of the world's economic output and military spending. Russia and China combined are less than 25%. Moreover, besides having the ability to produce things, the West has a long tradition of being able to work together. Lots of alliances, lots of organizations. They're able to do so because they have trust in each other, because they share not just interests, but values. Well, this leads me to my third point, which is this is a moment, but moments pass. And I think the challenge is to get back to the charge you put to me, Jonathan. Will the West take advantage of this moment to institutionalize the cooperation that we have seen in the last 2 months? And I think that is an open question. The fact that we have unity now doesn't mean we will have unity tomorrow or in the fall or next year. There are lots of pressures for countries to want to turn to other issues, to not face the manifest challenge that we in the West face with the decay and possible end of the rules-based order. I will note, however, that there is something pushing in the opposite direction. And I think that is the recognition, not just in Washington or in London, but also in Tokyo, Canberra. We can go down the list of world capitals, that all these countries have a vital interest in seeing the rules-based order be sustained, along with the recognition that none of them is capable of doing that on their own, not even the United States. Now, I want to be very careful here that we talk about revitalizing, reinvigorating the rules-based order. It is not about facing a security challenge. It is about facing an array of challenges: security, economic, diplomatic, human rights. And it's not something that can be returned to where we were in 1955 or 1965. Pax Americana is not coming back, if only for the reasons that I don't believe the United States is interested in exercising Pax Americana. Now, I do want to stress that I don't in any way mean to suggest that it will be easy to get cooperation. And there are all different kinds of ways cooperation can take place and ways it can be institutionalized. I think Jim was quite right when he said that we used to have a hub and spokes system that worked. Countries sort of dealt with Washington, and then Washington dealt with all the satellites. We're moving more toward a more, I guess, I'll borrow your phrase, lattice type structure. I think we even need something more formal than that going forward. And I will note again that lots of reasons why that might happen, not the least because of the domestic politics in the United States, in what might happen in the election in 2.5 years. But on this point, I recall the words attributed to Benjamin Franklin after he signed the American Declaration of Independence way back in 1776. And he told his fellow delegates, "We must hang together, or surely we will hang separately." And I think that is the challenge that we face today.
Jim, and I think you're very clairvoyant because you're leading me directly to the moderated question. And the first question will go directly to you actually first, and then we'll sort of make our way down. I really liked your point about the sustainability of the moment. It's easy to get ourselves in a moment, and we like to celebrate our unity, and I think that's a great thing to do. But sustaining that, and sustaining that obviously in Europe, but sustaining that in the Indo-Pacific is going to be a different thing. The second point is preparing for we have the crisis of today, but preparing for the crisis of tomorrow. And realizing that the crisis of tomorrow will not be the crisis of today. And I think this leads me to my first question to everyone on the panel is about architecture. And I think, Jim, you were hinting at this towards the end of your remarks. And we're not trying to give a subtle hint or not so subtle hint to the Canadian side with our quad picture here in the backdrop. But the reality is the Indo-Pacific is not the transatlantic. Despite the fact that NATO is not a perfect organization, and you can gripe with some of the ways that it's dealt with this, I think NATO's done a really good job in dealing with this challenge right now in Europe. The Indo-Pacific does not have that sort of mechanism. We do have a few multilateral organizations, but effectively it's a spaghetti bowl of minilaterals, trilaterals, the quadrilateral now reborn, in addition to bilateral alliances, et cetera. So is that okay? Is that workable? Is the evolution of this the proper way to respond to some of the challenges that we might see in this region, many of them emanating from China? Or is there a need for some bigger thinking that potentially you were hinting at? I know when the former U.S. administration and Secretary Pompeo had one of the first Quad meetings and talked about Asian NATO, and you could see his counterpart sort of trying to duck under a coffee table somewhere. Maybe half of them agreed with the idea, but still the tenability of an Asian NATO, I think, is still very difficult for many in the region who have China as their number one economic and trade partner. So I wonder if I can turn to you first on this idea of architecture, how this might look, how this should look, and then I'll make my way down.
Certainly. I guess I would begin by agreeing with you that there is a sort of mix of different methods, institutions in the Indo-Pacific. They don't map up with the institutions that you see in Europe or in the transatlantic relationship. I would just take that as a given. I do think on the specific issue of an Asian NATO is to make the mistake I do not wish us to see, which is to reduce a broad-based challenge to the rules-based order to a security question, number one. Second point I would make is, well, let me preface by saying I'm a big hockey fan. And, well, if you knew what team I root for, you may not be clapping. But I'm a big hockey fan, and so I know about hockey stars and the great philosopher Wayne Gretzky, who said that when asked why he was the greatest, well, I think actually Bobby Orr was the greatest, but we won't go into that issue. Jim may think it's Gordie Howe. Okay. But was asked what made him great, and he said, I skate to where the puck will be, not where the puck is. And I think part of what we have to do in terms of thinking about architecture is not begin by telling ourselves we can't get there, because right now we face all kinds of complications. That's not the attitude that statesmen took, let's say, after the end of World War II in building what became the European Union or the Transatlantic Alliance. So I want to say, be positive about it, have a can-do attitude, and to focus on bringing countries together. Third point I'll make in response to your question is that there are a number of countries in the Indo-Pacific who are quite eager to develop institutional relationships to deepen those commitments. You have the good fortune of hosting this meeting as Joe Biden is holding meetings in Seoul with new South Korean President Yoon, in which this is one of the very issues on the table. He is going to go either tomorrow or today, I'm really not sure where we are on the time scale, to Tokyo, where he is going to meet with Prime Minister Kishida, who is going to be pushing a theme that's been pushed since the time of Prime Minister Abe, that we need to deepen our cooperation. And hey, don't think of it all in security terms. We are, Japan, willing to work there. We also want to see you in the Pacific in economic terms. And I do think that what the Biden administration is putting on the table, the Indo
Pacific
Economic Framework. IPEF is pretty weak tea, and I guess I'll just leave it at that. Certainly not meeting the moment, which gets back to the issue or point I made before about obstacles to seizing the moment, lying not the least in American domestic politics. Finally, if you want to know what I would propose, I will tell you that Ivo Daalder, who is the president of the Chicago Council of Foreign Relations and former U.S. ambassador to NATO, and I have an article that is scheduled to come out in Foreign Affairs, which makes the call for creating a G12, which is designed to institutionalize cooperation among, call it the G7 members, add in Australia and New Zealand, give the seat to the EU and NATO, and that the focus should be quite different from the G7, which is really addresses issues in an ad hoc fashion, but to have an organization that is committed fundamentally to act in a coherent, coordinated way to address all of the challenges facing the rules-based order and create a forum in which those issues can be discussed. It's going to take a lot of give and take. It certainly can't be an organization that is Washington directs and others follow. That won't work, either for America's friends, partners, and allies, or I think for the American public. But it's also a way, certainly for the United States, to see that its friends, partners, and allies are also bearing responsibilities themselves. And again, I do think if you look across the world, not just in Europe, not just in Asia, I think, if anything, the message of February 24th is things that we value are at great risk. We have to do more. And I think countries have been willing to do more. And I think that the challenge of diplomacy, certainly for the Biden administration, is to make something of this moment. And again, a challenge for those of you who work in government, know that it's great to think about what you're going to establish 2-5 years down the road. Hard to do when your whole day is dominated by what you have to do right this very moment because you're dealing with the crisis. But it is great statespeople who are able to take advantage of such moments to make advances.
2 or 3 decades of discussion of Asian architecture. And what's been striking to me is this has really been an evolutionary process. We don't know what the end state is going to be, but we continue to engage in it. And it kind of reminds me of Deng Xiaoping about crossing the river, a feeling for the stones. And that's the direction we're going. I think there's a great sense of collaboration. I think Ukraine has really brought home to the Indo-Pacific the importance of working together as Western democracies. And we're going to continue to address these problems. What the ultimate architecture is going to look like, I think that's very hard to say. But I think it is going to be collaborative. You know, can we institutionalize it? We've tried that so many times. There are so many ASEAN institutionalized dialogues, et cetera. So where does this all lead? I'm not sure, but I think it leads in the direction of increasing collaboration among Indo-Pacific democracies. The Quad's a reflection of that. And again, where's the Quad going to go? To my mind, the Quad's success is not going to be determined by any perception of it as an Asian NATO. I think that's a collapse of the Quad if that happens. The Quad will be successful if it really addresses the needs of the region, if it addresses the infrastructure issues, climate change, health, and across the board. These are the key issues that are affecting the region, and these are the key issues that are going to determine, to my mind, the success of the Quad. Just talking with the New Zealand High Commissioner earlier today, and we talked about the Solomon Islands. Mm-hmm. Now, here's an infrastructure problem across the South Pacific that is looking for resolution. And again, to my mind, this is something that the Quad should be clearly engaged in. How do you address these issues?
When we think about architecture, we're making a mistake because we're assuming that there is one very neat little plan of organization, nice and tidy, that will take care of everything. Yep. If there's one thing that should resonate with democracies is that you have lots of organizations with overlapping memberships, that they can be complicated. So it isn't that you create an organization and everybody who you like is in it and
Signs up.
everybody else is outside of it. You want to have interconnections because however the West chooses to respond to the moment, if it succeeds in building sustained cooperation, the purpose of it is to try to sustain this rules-based order. It's not to put down or hold down China or to make it a democracy. It is basically try to insist on several principles: state sovereignty, respect for the rule of law, and cooperation. Peaceful, Jim's better than I am on this, peaceful resolution of disputes. That is what is at stake. And again, it does not prevent the West from cooperating with China or with Russia where their interests align, where they can get things done. And I think that's the notion we have to keep in mind. We need to do two things. We need to stand up for our values and interests. And I think for at least a decade, most countries in the West haven't. They kept hoping that the whole notion of strategic engagement would actually work and that China would become a responsible stakeholder, Russia would be a responsible stakeholder, and we wouldn't have to make any tough choices. Well, guess what? It's pretty clear we're going to have to make tough choices. But at the same time, you want to find ways to work with others where you can. You have to walk and chew bubble gum at the same time. And I think that's going to be a challenge because our politics, particularly in the United States, tends to drive us into a us against them sort of posture. Whereas any overture, any concession, any offer to the other side is seen as a sign of weakness. And I think that's the politics that's going to be very hard to navigate.
I think just quickly, Una, before turning to you, I mean, great points by both the Jims.
We got the Jim corner.
The Jim corner over here, which is really doing well. One point on this, and I think Jim P., your initial comments, I think, really highlighted this, and I think it's really important to keep in mind too when thinking whether it's architecture or variable geometry, is again not everything be on the shoulders of the United States on this as well. One of the most successful elements of the rebirth of the Quad was the leadership from Japan, the leadership from Prime Minister Modi in India. And there's a number of different alignments that are happening that actually some of them don't include the United States. One example is the Australia, India, Japan trilateral. So there are different forms of these alignments that I think actually support U.S. interests and values, but don't necessarily always include the United States in every single vehicle. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Una, to you, please.
Yeah, for me to speak about the Indo-Pacific, representing a nation that's one of the greatest naval nations in the Indo-Pacific, Latvia, is probably wrong. I should lend more time to Scott. But still, I mean, I have to somehow justify sitting at this panel. So on the Asian NATO, I think that I take your point about, Singapore and suddenly standing up to Russia and not being neutral, but I also have a different view because I interact with a different community. I interact with the think tank community in ASEAN, and I feel that the Ukraine story has discouraged these countries. So on one hand, yes, politically they jumped at the opportunity to say that, Russia, this is not okay, you guys. But on the other hand, the idea that Ukraine kind of rocked the boat is very widespread. Let's not lie to ourselves, right? There is the victim-blaming narrative across ASEAN is very widespread in the case of Russia's war in the Ukraine. So I think that in this case, it would be premature to believe that Ukraine has pushed the region towards some sort of an Asian NATO thinking. And when I talk to my colleagues at ASEAN, they tell me that ASEAN is kind of the EU except very different. So I think what the region needs is, it does not need an Asian NATO, but it does need a kind of NATO, except very different. And I think your initial question, is this current architecture with the patchwork and with these nimble formats, is it workable? I think absolutely. Because NATO itself has challenges when it comes to being, in changing course and in making decisions. So I think actually it's the other way around. NATO's got a lot to learn from the emergent security architecture, the unilateralism in the Indo-Pacific.
I hope some
Yeah.
of these points were at least somewhere in
Those
the
are
ballpark.
excellent. And before, Admiral, turning to you, just to make a point, because we're here in Canada on this, is I think this is a very, very important discussion for the Canadian audience to hear. We love multilateralism. You show us a club and we're in. The reality is that, yes, multilateralism is necessary, but is definitely insufficient to deal with some of the challenges. And I know we may have some disagreement on this point in the panel, to deal with all the challenges in this part of the world. And I think, frankly, you have to get down in the mud here a little bit. It's a little bit different, and it's a little bit uncomfortable than the way that we're usually used to conducting ourselves diplomatically. And so I think in order to play in this part of the world and play successfully, yes, it's great to attend ASEAN Regional Forum, and I'm sure many in the room have attended those meetings before, in APEC, et cetera. But you're going to have to do both. You're going to have to engage in the minilaterals. You're going to have to engage in the multilaterals. And that may make us feel uncomfortable here in Canada, but I think we have to do it. Admiral, I'll turn to you. And then after this, we're going to move to the audience, because I know everyone's been waiting patiently. Please.
Just to clarify that point, so you're suggesting that Canada's uncomfortable in multilaterals or uncomfortable in bilaterals?
I think we're very comfortable in multilaterals.
Yeah, okay.
So I think that's
good. That's a good place to be.
Yeah.
So a couple thoughts here is I like making polarizing statements, and you get to the core. It takes you forever to start in the margins and get to the real issues. Rarely do I get to the real issue. So I don't think we need another structure or another organization. I think Jim framed it better than I can. I think architecture is important. There's a discussion about now that Quads is established, how do we get into Quads? As if it's a Quad plus something. I'm tapping the brakes to be polite, and truth be told, I want to put it in park and set the parking brake. Because of the countries that are in Quads, I think it needs time to grow within itself internally to understand who they are for at least a year or longer before we start to externalize it. But there's all kinds of multilateral relationships to be had with Quad. So I would encourage those that are suggesting that they want to be a part of it to have a discussion unilaterally, bilaterally, with each one of the Quad members and ask them their opinion and take the collective opinions and figure out how do we plug ourselves into that and why. I go back to a statement that I made earlier. We talk about what to do starts with what not to do. It's much easier to determine that and fence that area out. Do no harm first before you jump in with great intentions and then looking back and realizing maybe those intentions aren't deliverable. I hesitate to use a military example, but Her Majesty's ship Queen Elizabeth made a deployment. I was actually in London almost 2 years ago in discussions about how to think through that. I thought I was going to have a discussion with defense, but it was a discussion with foreign ministry. It was a fantastic dialogue about how to structure that and the mechanisms of how ships attach themselves and detach themselves based on the national interest of the countries whose flags they flew. Dutch had ships attached when it was transiting areas that they had particular national interest. And that continued really all the way across until the Queen Elizabeth was all the way over into the Pacific. So I think that those structures have much more value. Structures that have rules associated with them, but it's not necessarily being a part of the Quad or a part of ASEAN. I'm not a diplomat. And my experience directly with ASEAN ended really almost 4 years ago when I retired. But I said then, and I continue to say now, I think the most powerful U.S. ambassador in the Indo-Asia-Pacific is the ambassador to ASEAN. It's a very loose organization. They're very uncertain about themselves. They're uncertain about where do they stand individually as in the country they represent, as well as with the ASEAN structure itself. They've got a defense element to it, exercises that they host. That is a fantastic place for liberal democracies to come individually and think holistically about how do we turn this into what I would suggest would be a more fulfilling organization. So I would look at the existing organizations before there's a discussion about increasing the number of organizations. Really interesting about the empty throne, Jim, what I wrote down is there's opportunity with erosion of the power at the seat at the head of the table, euphemistically talking about the United States. For lots of different reasons, I think the United States went through a period where we turned inward, and our view of the external world is, our power can overcome the lack of presence there. I don't believe that was the case then. I don't believe that's the case now. But that has created opportunities. Where there's instability and uncertainty, there is opportunity. You don't have to look at those elements as something to counter. There's something to embrace and think in the context of how can we be more stabilizing from the perspective, I think, of liberal democracies. James mentioned TPP. I'll close on this point. I had to be careful when I was in uniform taking a military position on a trade pact, but myself and Admiral Harris, who was the Indo-PACOM commander at the time, we spoke very loudly in private audiences and less loudly in public audiences about the critical importance of TPP. The importance being the rules and regulations contained within it, the governance, the fact that your personal information is protected, your banking information is protected, the way you negotiate in a commercial negotiation was managed by the rule sets of TPP. The one mistake we made, the United States made, is we didn't invite the PRC in. We wanted to exclude them. The best way to exclude them would have been to invite them in, because the rule sets that are contained with TPP were completely antithetical to the PRC system, the economic system, the governance system. So it's a long way to go about thinking in a broader context about the challenges that you're trying to resolve by building a new framework or a new organization. Think strategically, plan operationally, and act tactically. Think strategically means just develop a strategic vision, a national vision of a specific area. Plan operationally is simply develop a framework, boxes that you put those areas of interest that are devolved from that strategic vision. And then from each one of those boxes, through policy remits and demands, you drive tactical actions. But what I see happening in the commercial environment, the international relations environment, the military environment, we think, plan, and act tactically, and we don't understand why we can't get out ahead of the competition. So this building another structure is, I think, another edifice of thinking tactically, planning tactically, and acting tactically. What effect are we trying to create? What strategic vision is this fulfilling? Those are the questions that should drive the actions going forward.
Well, thanks very much, Admiral, and we'll open it up for question period now. But I liked your closing comments on the TPP, and perhaps you or your former colleagues at the Pentagon. I had heard this somewhere, anyways, that the idea of a multilateral trade agreement was worth more than an aircraft carrier, an extra aircraft carrier in the Pacific. And I think if we in Canada, maybe with our Japanese friends or others, can do any urging to give you that metaphorical aircraft carrier back, we're willing to help do the work to do that, to get you back into the club.
Well, let me answer that first question then. I'll say this about that. That's absolutely true, Jonathan. So it's about the relevancy of who you are as a nation and reducing the say-do gap between what you say and what you do. So HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. What is the most powerful element that an aircraft carrier produces every day and that we use most often? It creates 200,000 gallons of fresh water every day. So that's why a carrier responds to an HADR event, because what's the most critical resource in an HADR event? It's fresh water. It's fresh water. Why is fresh water important? Because it destabilizes liberal democracies when the citizens of that nation feels that its leadership can't take care of them. The basic necessities of life. We need to think about the problem set differently. It's all, to me, it's all about multilateralism, not to discourage bilateral engagements, but multilateralism. I think that's what we do, those of us that believe in liberal democracies.
In terms of building the rules-based order or sustaining it, it really is a multilateral effort to be able to advance the values and interests that we have. And I think one of the great problems or the great failures of the United States over the last maybe decade or so is that we have basically turned our back on a lot of the institutional rule-setting bodies, the WHO in particular, where we have pulled back. We have allowed the Chinese to really assert a strong position in these rule-making bodies that affects our long-term interests. And so I think this is, to me, it's a very important element that we have to really engage back at this multilateral level in the international institutions that set the international rules and standards which we're going to be subject to. I think we only penalize ourselves by not being part of the discussion. If we're letting someone else set our standards and rules is not in our long-term interests. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, let's open it up to questions now. I know we're getting towards the end of the day, but yes, please.
John Curtis, I'm a graduate of the federal government, having started with Trudeau the Elder some many years ago. I have a comment and a question. The comment is, through the 1980s and early 90s, going right back to the point of minutes ago, the country that opposed the creation of the World Trade Organization that Canada and our European Union friends were putting together, there was one country who opposed it, a very important country that opposed it, and that was the United States of America. It took us the longest time to persuade our American colleagues and friends in Geneva to, in fact, agree to a multilateral trade negotiation. So it runs through American history to avoid multilateral organizations. So it's not recent history, it's older history as well. The other history I'd like to ask or make a comment on is to ask the panel, you've talked about China in the first part of this millennium, but China has, for a long time, worried about unequal treaties, includes Hong Kong, of course. But you go right back to 1860, the most major unequal treaty that China has ever been forced to accept is with Russia, with the Russian Empire in 1860, when they lost a good portion of what is now eastern Siberia and the Pacific coast of Russia. And I'm wondering, how deep, asking the panel, how deep is really China's interest in supporting Russia? Yes, superficially in the contemporary environment, but I wonder deeply how close China is to Russia, given these unequal treaties. I think President Nixon took advantage of it in 1971, and as did our Prime Minister in 1972. I'm not convinced that one should only look at current events in order to establish international relations. Thank you.
That's a great question, and they're both avid readers of history, so there's a chance of Back to the Future here. Is there any other questions? I'd like to get one more question, and then we'll bundle them together. Yes, please.
Hi, Anvesh Jain, law student at the University of Ottawa. So traditionally in kind of Canadian foreign policy, at least, Asia and the Indo-Pacific has been seen as far foreign and foreboding. But as the parliamentary secretary emphasized earlier today, the Indo-Pacific is not far from us. In fact, it's closer to home than ever before. 20% of Canadian citizens at least trace their heritage to the Indo-Pacific, as you noted. And so that given that much of the invidious influence of autocratic states manifests in targeting of immigrant communities in the West, including disinformation and harassment campaigns, I'm thinking against Taiwanese community, Hong Kongers, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and many more immigrant and diaspora communities, how can Western state institutions better take our immigrant communities into confidence in order to achieve a more comprehensive and resilient society? So kind of saying that even though the panel suggests a response to Russia and China in the Indo-Pacific, an Indo-Pacific response is perhaps also available to us here. Thank you.
That's great. So let's start with those two questions, if you don't mind. And Una, maybe I'll start with you if you're okay to begin with.
Yeah, that's my jam. Exactly, the China-Russia thing. So thank you for your question. Absolutely, China remembers the unequal treaties very well, and there some conversations about this. They spark all the time, due to the fact that the discursive places, the public media places, are absolutely isolated between Russia and China. These stories rarely make it across the border. But for example, just recently there was a very zealous and very patriotical parent from Blagoveshchensk who petitioned against the phrase that Russia captured the Amur region because it was written in a Russian school book, which is historically, I guess the history buffs will agree, it's historically correct. But so yeah, the phrase was taken out of the book, and that story did make it to China, of course, immediately, about how Russia is not kind of the Russian imperialism that after the unequal treaties, that it's still there. There's also, of course, as many of you have heard, a museum on the Chinese side of the border, right there by the Heilongjiang, the Amur River, which tells the story of Russian aggression, and where Russian passport holders are not allowed in. So that's like a very low-tech solution how to ensure that insulation of information spaces. But so that is why, of course, distrust is the operative word for the Russia-China relationship today. And we see that among societies, we see that among establishments, we see that in jailing of scientists, for example, the Russian Arctic scientists that went to jail for allegedly disclosing some secrets about where the white bears roam in the Russian Arctic. Okay, we know it's military, of course, but still, at the end of the day, he's a scientist, so he's in jail now for getting too cozy with the Chinese. But at the end of the day, that's why I use the concept of perfect imbalance when I talk about the Russia-China relationship. That perfect imbalance, what it means is that stability is not the end game. It's not the goal to have a very stable relationship. It's about the internal and external factors that are pushing these two countries together. Internally, of course, we know, we've spoken about it. Both leaders have similar outlooks when it comes to ultimate sovereignty, when it comes to the role, the challenging the liberal order or even staying in power, in how to deal with a nation that's so multi-ethnic, but at the same time integrated around the core of the main nation. All these things are internal that are pushing them together and that make them feel close. External factors also, we talked about them today. The U.S. zero appeasement approach, the global situation in general. So yes, distrust is there, but there are factors that are just making them work together.
Great. If I can go to the Jim corner here, starting with Jim Lindsay, if you have any thoughts on the China-Russia question.
I imagine that relationship is probably stronger than we think it is or wish it would be. I think for some of the reasons that Una mentioned. And I think when you look at it from the China point of view, my sense is President Xi is thinking in the long term, and he sees the potential that countries may restrict supplies, raw materials to China. Russia is rich in natural resources. It is rich in energy to fuel the Chinese economy. I think the Chinese see Russia as being a junior partner, not a threat. I think they also see Russia as a country that has few other alternatives, hence a dependency is created there. I think the challenge, of course, for Western and American diplomacy is in the wake of Ukraine, if anything, we're reinforcing that. There was a lot of talk early in the Biden administration about were there ways to somehow nudge Putin away, to somehow, I'm not allowed to use the reset word in talking about U.S.-Russian relations, because it upsets people, but try to find some way to avoid driving Russia and China closer together. And the administration was unable to find a way, maybe because of failings in what the administration did. I think more so because Mr. Putin wasn't looking for a way out. And I do think in Russia, as in China, the person at the top drives policy in a much more fundamental way than you see in Western democracies. Now, of course, again, I think politically, to get up and talk about off-ramps or concessions to President Putin is borderline unthinkable in Western democracies, because it will be seen as rewarding an unjust war, a war of aggression, a war that violated international law. And I think that's a real challenge. And again, going back to the conversation this morning about imagining end states, I think that's part of the challenge. One, we don't know how it is going to end or when it will end, but also trying to think through what steps might you want to take to bring it to a more peaceful end. And is that sustainable in terms of the domestic politics in the member countries? Is President Putin at all listening? I mean, I think in the current conversation, no one wants to wave an olive branch if it is clear that Putin is just going to smack it out of your hand. So I think that's going to be a real challenge for Western diplomacy.
Okay, thanks so much. Jim Prizup, do you have any thoughts on that, this question?
No, I quite agree with Jim. That's
Okay, perfect.
So-
Admiral?
Yep.
I would agree with Jim as well. I would say this is that, well, even going back to your comment on the World Trade Organization, we're in a different world now. I mean, the centrality of power within any nation, including the United States, is challenged somewhat by the diminishment of U.S. power, but also the rise of PRC's power as well. And a lot of the U.S. side has been, in my opinion, self-imposed. There's not an interest in foreign policy on the man or woman in the street in the United States. I mean, right now it's all about what's happening with the economy, and are we going to end up in a recession? But having said that, I think there's a lesson in there. I think you mentioned the trade sanctions and unequal treaties. In my mind, it's all about the 100 years of humiliation and all about the sanctity of the sovereignty of China in the context of the Chinese Communist Party, and both of those commitments they have made to the Chinese people. So it's a vulnerability as well to include increasing wealth. But I would agree. I think Jim shaped it better than I could. I would summarize it simply to say that Russia needs the PRC much more than PRC needs Russia. Certainly mill to mill, it's very pedantic. The PRC is very circumspect about sharing too much with Russia about what they're doing, and yet they're happy to take as much as possible from Russia. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I heard a comment at another conference that before the war, China viewed Russia effectively as its gas station. After the war, it effectively looked at it as its dollarama, discount shopping.
Yeah.
And so I would agree that the value proposition there is clear on the China side.
Yeah, I think Jim's comment on resources can't be lost, because I think PRC is very concerned about being isolated through sanctions, and so they want to maintain that relationship with Russia to make sure they have access to resources.
Okay, great. Anvesh, I'm not sure that we addressed your question. I may give it a very quick answer, because I think it's important as well. When we think in Canada of the Indo-Pacific, and we can talk about what everybody else thinks about this part of the region, but I think it is important to think that we have our own equity, we have our own stake here. And one example, and I love our Dutch friends too, they have an Indo-Pacific strategy. And last time I looked at the Netherlands, I didn't see the Pacific being that close, whereas Canada, we very much are a Pacific nation. But the way that we think about this sometimes in policy terms doesn't quite come across that. And it's not just From a government perspective, this is something we need to engage private sector, civil society. It's going to come down to recruitment within the public service, political intelligence and literacy on these issues, and also a team effort, frankly. I mean, I think the way that this engagement, we've talked about statecraft being military, economic, diplomatic development from a track one government term, but we're going to have to increase that engagement much, much more with the private sector, more with think tanks, more with academics, et cetera. So I think the point is preaching to the choir, and I would agree. I mean, we really need to think of ourselves as an Indo-Pacific, as a Pacific player, rather than necessarily doing this because someone's pushing us in this direction, and we probably should do it because there's a lot going on in that part of the world, but really realize that this is a critical part of our values and interests.
Can I tag on that
Yeah,
just
please.
quickly to make sure? Was part of your question about equities of minority groups? So I think that's critically important. We need to be very careful about say-do gaps. We need to look for areas of convergence as well as divergence with all of those of us that are liberal democracies. When the line to get out of the United States is longer than the line to get in, I will be wicked terrified. So there's a lot of work for America to do in that area. And the fact that it's such a contentious debate shows what a challenge that is as a liberal democracy. But if we're not setting an example for ourselves, how can we set an example for others? So I think this is something I would encourage as a dialogue, private dialogue between liberal democracies about where are those issues that we see convergence and divergence bilaterally between us two. And then expand that discussion and say, and what does this do to diminish our ability to influence in areas where we have national security interests? I grew up on the west coast of the United States, so I get it that America is a Pacific nation. My wife is from the Boston area. They don't have a clue about America being a Pacific nation. They don't get that at all. You know, it's all about the four New England teams. So someone mentioned it earlier. Once again, it might have been Richard talking about national policy is driven by local politics. But I think those dialogues are very important because that is a rich dialogue in Asia. There's no such thing as Asia if you're in talking to Asians. They have a specific cultural affinity. They have a national affinity as well. And we run the risk of whitewashing them, to use a term that may not be very politically correct right now, but it applies.
Being from the Boston area, I will have to note, while it may be the case today that Massachusetts thinks little of the Pacific, go back 200 years, they thought a lot
Traders.
about it
Yeah.
because there was a tremendous amount of trade. So again, I think history can change and people can become aware of interests, and interest can change over time. Second thing, I'm going to do a shameless plug for my colleague Yasha Monk, because the question you ask goes to the heart of the book he just published called The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure, which goes in a series of these challenges and how they're being dealt with and addressed in countries around the world. So I'm just going to plug Yasha's book.
You talk about how geographic interests change. And to me, what's been striking is when you look at what's happened in terms of the U.S.-Japan commercial relationship, that I was involved in the auto wars in the late 70s and early 80s, and as part of the Presidential Commission, Reagan-Nakasone Commission on U.S.-Japan relations. And one of the points we made to our Japanese colleagues was that if you want to lower the temperature in terms of the anti-Japanese sentiment in the auto industries, you need to put auto workers to work in the United States. And it was quite striking. 4 or 5 years later, we started seeing investment come in to the South, and the South has become very interested now. Tennessee,
Georgetown, Kentucky has a huge Toyota
exactly,
plant.
where this has had a strategic change in the way people understand their economic interests now.
We're seeing something similar happening right now with the relocation of semiconductor plants
Yeah.
in very different places. So,
Airbus is big in the South now from a manufacturing perspective. We don't talk enough about diversity, in my opinion. We're willing to embrace diversity in our financial portfolios. Why aren't we willing to embrace diversity in our boardrooms and our organizational structures? It's the power of who we are regardless of the organization is. And if I surround myself with white males that grew up in Southern California, spent 40 years in the Navy, flew F-18s, are bald and have a mustache, we can solve any problem in about 2 seconds. But bring somebody in that is from a different culture, a different religion, a different race, a different gender, a different ethnicity. Their life experiences are different, and the ideas that they bring to the dialogue are different. It's the ideas that make us powerful. We're divorcing ourselves from those ideas by not embracing diversity. We need to change the dialogue. And that dialogue, I think, is a rich dialogue that's going on, creating frictions in liberal democracies. Those dialogues are not occurring in Russia and China. That's why I say I worry more about the fall of China than the rise of China. I'm not convinced their system can survive itself. But
Yeah. Well, folks, thank you so much for this. I think we got into a lot of topics, and I think it's a good point. Depending on where you are geographically, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Canada, you have a different outlook, thinking about different parts of the world. I grew up in Halifax, so we were far away from the
they're
Indo-Pacific.
crazy. They're
Yeah, we are. We don't have the wicked mad terminology of the Bostonians, but I would say Bobby Orr is very popular in Halifax as well.
Got that picture in
Jim,
the house.
We share this alignment. This was really excellent, and thank you to the audience especially for those who are troopers and stayed the whole day. There's so many different things we could tease out on this. Some of the themes that came to my mind from listening to both of these panels and sort of tying together some of the themes. We didn't have the time to discuss on this panel energy security, but when I was talking about preparing for the crisis of tomorrow and not necessarily the crisis of today, again, Heather's remarks, my colleague Heather on the first panel really got me thinking about this too, because some of these exact same issues that we're talking about right now in Europe, you put that times 10 on the dial, and that's what we're gonna see in the Indo-Pacific. China included, the biggest economies in Asia are reliant for about 85 to 90% of their energy from the Gulf, which transits through very vulnerable choke points. So that's one point that I think is important and shared on both dimensions. The second one is below threshold conflict. Whether it's disinformation, whether it's gray zone tactics, it is going to be articulated in different ways, and I think the way that Russia has prosecuted its war in Ukraine may make us believe that they're not as interested in below threshold conflict. But the reality is they've been engaged in this for some time, and the Chinese live in this space, whether it's in the maritime field with, again, it not being your grandmother or grandfather's Coast Guard with large ships that effectively are military ships side by side with fishing vessels, with commercial vessels. These are the type of elements that we're going to have to deal with, the different ways of assessing conflict. So again, thank you to everyone on this panel for a really insightful discussion. I really enjoyed it. We can debate about hockey players afterwards over our speakers dinner. And thank you so much.
We can, but I'm right.
Yes, yeah.
I've got a Gretzky story for you.
But and thank you so much to the audience for joining for the entire day, and feel free to stay. The official program is now finished, but we have the room for another hour or so. So feel free to. There hasn't been much networking in the last 2+ years, so feel free to enjoy a coffee and a snack and get to know your fellow participants. So thank you so much.